Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 32nd episode of Chebacco Chats. My name is Tim Garrity, and today I am presenting on a subject that is very special to me, and I hope you think so by the time we're done. Let me get my slideshow going here. All right, we are ready to go. Thought we were ready to go. Now we're ready to go. So the title of this presentation is The Inscription at Seawall and George Hefflon's Silent Mission. But the first thing I want to say is thanks to Bar Harbor Bank and Trust for sponsoring this week's Chebacco Chat. Let me get you oriented to this place that we're talking about. By the causeway at the northern end of the seawall area of Acadia National Park, there's a natural pier of granite that extends almost a quarter mile into the western way, the channel that separates Great Cranberry Island from seawall. And I'm going to zoom in here, get you a little closer. When the water is calm, high tide laps at the base of this ledge. And during storms, big waves overwhelm the ledge, their brims flying all the way over the causeway road, sometimes leaving rocks up on the roadway itself. And when the big waves recede, if you're out there, you can hear the stones rattling back across the ledge to the ocean. And on a vertical face, at the very sea-facing edge of that ledge, someone has carved an inscription. It says 1895-1900 GHH. And that's where this story starts. Its meaning has long been a mystery. The most common explanation is that it pertains to, it marks the spot where a child was swept out to sea and drowned. A newspaper story in 2007 quoted Annabelle Robbins, who owned the nearby seawall dining room. She told the Bar Harbor Times that a child was washed out to sea from that spot, but she couldn't recall the name. And Don Lenihan, who wrote his book in 2010, The Memorials of Acadia National Park, said the inscription might say CHH or GHH, but that no individual has been identified to these letters. Lenihan concluded the mystery continues. Well, along came Theo Gardner, who at the time was 13 years old, and he worked as an intern at the Historical Society for several weeks for 2 summers. He determined to find out the meaning of this inscription. After a thorough but fruitless search of local newspapers, Theo went to the Maine State Archives in Augusta and examined all the birth records from 1895 and all the death records from 1900, but found no one with corresponding initials and lifespan. Theo searched news accounts and obituaries from Mount Desert Island, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, but to no avail. Finally, the last thing he did before he ended his internship is he appealed to the public for answers in a press release published in the Mount Desert Islander in July 2015. Now, an aside here, Theo is now grown up. He's a student at the University of Chicago, and he used the story of his search and how it ended up as the basis for his admission application. Well, the story was published in 2015. 3 years go by, but it sat with George Gilpin, a church historian for the Southwest Harbor Congregational Church. And George walked into the Mount Desert Island Historical Society in the spring of 2018 and said, "I think I know who this is." By that time I said, "Who is?" Well, he reminded me of this inscription. Working in the church archives, George remembered the inscription when he came across the name of the Reverend George H. Hefflon, GHH, who served the church as minister from 1895 to 1900. Once we had a name, we realized that George Gilpin had unlocked the mystery. The life of George Henry Hefflon is transparent. Public records of his life are plentiful. And more than that, it's his journals that are most revealing. George Hefflon was a faithful diarist, writing a page or so almost every night for 25 years, recording his daily experiences and his intimate thoughts. He left his entire diary collection to Yale University, his alma mater. We know from Reverend Hefflon's private diaries that he was unsettled in his vocation. He was celibate but wished to be married, was poor with few prospects of earning a living wage, and he experienced a deafness that eventually became total. These personal challenges barred him from some of the things he wanted: a loving marriage, a comfortable income, and peace of mind. His impediments also guided him towards the only avenue that seemed open to him: a life of self-sacrifice and service among the poor and the deaf, a ministry that was appreciated by a widespread community of people who needed him. George Hefflon was born July 10th, 1865, in Deep River, Connecticut. The son of a carriage maker and blacksmith, he graduated from Yale in 1891, studied at Drew Theological Seminary, and proceeded to pastoral assignments first in Massachusetts, then as a congregational minister here on Mount Desert Island in 1895 to 1900, as you know. And when he arrived on Mount Desert Island, he was 30 years old, tall and slim, with thinning hair. And he had a marked hearing impairment that grew more pronounced in time. The young pastor immersed himself in work for the Mount Desert Congregational Church of Tremont, which then had two branches in Southwest Harbor and Bass Harbor. He preached, visited congregants, read, and prepared sermons. Though public reports describe him as well-liked, his diaries reveal the thoughts of a discontented and restless young man, uncertain about his career, unhappy in his present circumstances, and worried about his future. Hefflon was easily wounded by social slights and irked by difficult people. He felt the sting of little humiliations, as when another minister was asked to officiate at the funeral of one of his congregants, or more painfully, when a member of his church said, he wrote in his diary, some hateful things, that she thought we ought to have a new minister. All around him, he saw impoverished and unattractive neighborhoods that raised up young people bound for unruly lives. He wrote of one young man, "I never liked the fellow, especially since I knew of his seducing two Bass Harbor girls, having children by both, and stealing $25 from the debating society." But one problem concerned him most. Hefflon longed for female companionship. "When work is over, I feel thankful," he wrote, "yet empty-hearted, starved of sentiment. I'd like to go courting some lovely girl." His diaries record his attraction to several young women of his congregation, among them the beautiful young Nellie Carroll. Miss Carroll, alas, did not reciprocate. She tried to let him down easy by blaming his profession. She told him she could never be a minister's wife, whose job description appealed to her not at all. She could never like church work, he wrote, never could do it. Hefflon did not handle the rejection well. And when he replied in a letter to Nellie, he wrote, "I suspect she will not like some parts of it." You know a little bit about Nellie Carroll. She lived at the Carroll Farm, that's now part of Acadia National Park. And she wrote a very popular and enduring work of local history under the authorship of Mrs. Seth Thornton. She eventually married, of course. It's called Reminiscences of Southwest Harbor and Soamesville. Soon, another woman caught the Reverend Hefflon's eye, but left him flummoxed. One evening, he saw Julia Kittredge and talked a while with her. I wish that girl would take me for a husband or else leave me alone. I am utterly taken by her. At one social gathering, he had what he described as a miserable exhibition of my weakness for that girl. I don't know what I should do. And here is a photograph. Oh, I meant to say that this is a familiar location. This is the bridge into Bass Harbor. The Tremont Elementary School is to the right of this image. And you can see that the Bass Harbor Church is a little farther down the road, and that's where Hefflon worked. We don't know the identity of this young girl, but she would be about the right age. Of course, she had sisters too, so we really don't know as Julia Kittredge. And another quote from the Reverend Hefflon, he said, "Letter under the door of my room from Julia K. Sorry for me, pities me, wishes she could do something, but cannot marry me, for she loves another." Hefflon's hearing loss increased his isolation. His hearing steadily deteriorated in these years, and he would sometimes give up on conversations that he could not hear. The fact that he had to lean in close to hear people made him familiar with many forms of bad breath. He found escape from his cares in the outdoors, especially in bike riding, even when rough roads and dark nights made his exercise dangerous. He would often ride his bike from his lodgings in Southwest Harbor to Seawall's windswept ledge, where he wrote, "It was good to feel the storm buffeting you." Seawall was a very comforting place for the Reverend Hefflon, who liked to get out and just feel the wind on his face. Well, Hefflon's dissatisfactions grew to the point where he left Mount Deserted Island in 1900 to take a church assignment in Ellsworth Falls. Didn't last too long. He moved on to assignments in New Hampshire, went back to divinity school, but never finding satisfaction in his life. And until he encountered what the church, especially the Episcopal Church, was doing for deaf people. In the early 20th century, religious institutions were beginning to recognize the needs and potential for deaf people and advocate on their behalf. The Episcopal Church had long been in the forefront of ministry to the deaf. In 1851, the Reverend Thomas Gallaudet founded St. Anne's Church for the Deaf in New York City and was the first to incorporate sign language into worship services. In November 1906, Hefflon went to New York with his sister, Jessie, and he writes, "Attended St. Anne's Church for Deaf Mutes, a very interesting experience. This is my future work." And it was like a key turned in George Hefflon's life. He began to see a path forward. He started to learn sign language and discovered the presence of a community of deaf people who seemed to appreciate what he was trying to do. In 1907, he was ordained a deacon in the Episcopal Church and committed himself to serving the deaf. All the while, he was crossing from the hearing into the silent world, and he increasingly accepted his solitude. I live by myself, he wrote. My deafness cuts me off from others, yet I am not unhappy in it. In his 40s, the internal and interpersonal conflicts that troubled his early ministry lessened. As his own deafness increased, he found his place among the deaf, and he determined that their physical and spiritual well-being would be his life's work. From 1907 to 1909, he served as assistant minister in Philadelphia's All Souls Church. He learned lip reading and sign language and served the deaf of the community. Living among the poor in Philadelphia, Hefflon began to sympathize with their political causes, even those of anarchists and socialists. The Yale alumnus, familiar with the privileges of his wealthy classmates, wrote, "All my sympathies are with the poor. I have a sort of hatred in my heart of the rich, so selfish, so ostentatious, their automobiles, their beautiful, luxurious homes, their every indulgence in fine things, travel, art, fine living friends. while thousands suffer for the common comforts all around them. One cold day in February 1907, Hefflon saw two boys stealing coal from a freight car. A boy climbed onto the car and threw down chunks of coal to his accomplice, enough to fill two heavy bags. As one of the boys struggled to drag his load up the bank, Hefflon climbed down to help him. He saw that the child's stocking showed through the holes in his shoes. And in his diary that night, Hefflon acknowledged that this small act of abetting a theft left him feeling that he had really helped someone. In 1909, Hefflon moved from Philadelphia to Hartford, Connecticut, to take a position with the Episcopal Mission for the Deaf. It was a risky step. Small numbers of deaf people were scattered about cities in the region, a handful in Springfield, about 30 in Hartford, 10 or 20 in Bridgeport, and a dozen or so in New Haven. He wondered how such tiny and widespread gatherings could produce the minimal income he would need. He asked, "And how shall I live?" God knows. Hefflon began his work with the Silent Mission in May 1909. A newspaper reporter who visited a worship service wrote, "One of the most peculiar public services ever held in Hartford was that in the chapel of the Church of the Good Shepherd yesterday afternoon, a service for deaf mutes, peculiar, impressive, and pathetic. It was conducted in silence, the sign and manual language being used, and the audience, while small, was most attentive. For Silent Mission services, Hefflon translated the elegant text of the Book of Common Prayer into sign language, and where the equipment was available, he accompanied his sermons with illustrations from lantern slides and motion pictures. A woman who knew him, and he's the tall one on the right, a woman who knew him provides a sketch of his appearance and personality. Margaret Gillen, a granddaughter of the Reverend Thomas Gallaudet, wrote, "His earnest speech, gauntness, and deep eyes stirred us deeply, like a voice crying in the wilderness." She also described a lighter side. She wrote, "One day in July 1917, he met us on a busy Hartford street and made a deep bow. We promptly dropped him a curtsy, which delighted him." Hefflon's immersion into church work mostly eclipsed the discontent of his youth. In 1912, he wrote, "Busy till late in the evening and not a moment to spare, not time for a bath even. I am a busy man. May God directly, daily. Amen." But the demands of his work eventually exhausted and overwhelmed him. In 1923, now he's in his 60s, a newspaper for the deaf community reported that he would take a respite from his pastoral duties due to ill health. The report said, "The great exertion he put forth to carry forward the Christmas festivities in various cities in New England was too much for him to shoulder, and the result was he simply broke down." Hefflon undertook a long convalescence, taking time for rest and recreation. He even learned how to play golf. Now, in September 1924, Hefflon returned to Mount Desert Island. He was feeling the effects of age. He saw that much had changed for the better since he left Maine 18 years before. You know that by now the park had been established and the quality of steamer transport had improved. Towns and villages were cleaner and more prosperous. He stayed at the upscale Claremont Hotel, played 18 holes of golf at the course by Norwood Cove, and toured the island from Bar Harbor to Sergeant Drive by auto. And with friends, he cruised by motorboat to Baker Island, Northeast Harbor, and Somme Sound. Still had an eye for the girls. He said among the party aboard the boat was a dear blue-eyed flapper who smokes too many cigarettes. He visited with Grace Carroll, the younger sister of his former love interest, Nellie Carroll Thornton. And we're now back to Seawall and that inscription. On an afternoon as blue, clear, and mild as a Maine September can conjure, Hefflon went down to the rocks at Seawall with a party of old friends. They made a fire and roasted clams and lobsters, ate crackers, rolls, and olives, and washed it all down with coffee boiled on the spot. Then he wrote, "We had fun with the waves, Tide was rising, and one could stand on a rock and watch for a wave to catch him, as it invariably did. Returning to Southwest Harbor from Seawall in late afternoon, Hefflon visited a cemetery and the graves of several of his former friends. On Sunday, he attended 3 services, the Episcopal at St. John's Chapel and Congregational in Southwest Harbor and Bass Harbor. He thought of those I prayed with and long walks or bicycle rides I took watching the sea or the sunsets. He remembered his old congregants who once filled the pews and now were gone. Happy memories, he once wrote. Yes, we all have them. Glints of mellow and golden light falling lovingly across the path of the bygone years, mingling with the shadows of our failures and sorrows and sins, but tender glints of heavenly light just the same. Hefflon's life came to an end in April 1925. In Providence, Rhode Island, he stepped out of an automobile and into the path of a streetcar. He was struck down and severely injured. The news of his death 3 days later brought shock and sorrow to Mount Desert Island and the deaf community throughout New England. Said one eulogist, "No more self-sacrificing and self-immolating man ever lived. How he subsisted on his infinitesimally small stipend is incomprehensible. He served the cause of the deaf and carried to them the office and comforts of the church with zeal and love, and they should ever revere his memory." Now, in my search of the diary entries in the Hefflon collection at Yale, I didn't find an acknowledgement that he inscribed the rock at Seawall, but it seems certain that Hefflon is the subject and probable that he is the author of the carving. The rock at Seawall, with its inscription 1895, 1900 GHH, marks the time that a man who struggled as a young pastor here for 5 years and then moved on until the misfortunes that troubled him most, deafness, celibacy, and poverty, guided his path toward a life of service to the deaf. Well, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. I will see if there's any questions up on Zoom, and you can ask me there, or let me look up our Facebook page, and if you have questions there, you can put a comment right in the comments section. I find that this inquiry into a life of George Hefflon was one of the most interesting and satisfying that I've experienced. And in fact, I would love to go down to Yale some more to look at his diaries. I wasn't able to read every page. There's thousands of pages, maybe 3,000 pages. So I had to, in the time I had available to me then, I had to skim through pretty quickly. So again, if you have any questions for me, let me have them. Not seeing any right now. But let's look on Zoom. Nothing there. Well, if you have any, if you do have any questions for me, please put them up on our Facebook page, and I'll be happy to answer them there. If you're watching this live, or if you're watching this on YouTube. And I do have news for you next week. We have the fortune of interviewing Bruce Jacobson, who's the executive director of the History Trust, an organization of gathering of organizations that are committed to making their digital archives available to the community. Bruce will be here talking about the History Trust and its work, and showing us some of his favorite items from the collection. Well, looks like one questions. Oh, Brian Richter asked, does he have any siblings or nieces or nephews? He had one sister, Jessie, who was very loyal to him, and he relied on her very much. She was frequently cited in his obituary as someone who would be very disappointed to learn the terrible news of his death. And it was with Jessie that he attended the church at St. Anne's in New York to his first experience of visiting a service for the deaf. Well, again, it's great to have you on our watching this, and I hope you can come back the Thursday after Thanksgiving. It will be December 3rd for a session with Bruce Jacobson. Looking forward to seeing you then. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.